Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
As Hoshin mentioned, today we are taking up gate 46 of the 108 gates of Dharma illumination. So since we have a few folks here this morning that have not joined us on Sundays before, quick review. This text, this 108 gates, is included or was included in the 12 fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. It's mostly a long quote, a long piece of text, which was dropped down from another item called the Sutra of the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So this 108 gates is not something that Dogen wrote in the original, but he comments on it at the end of where it gets put down in the Shobogenzo. He makes a little comment about that. So he's pretty much just encouraging us to investigate all of these gates. So week by week on Sundays, I've been taking each one of these gates and talking about it. So today, gate 46, the statement reads, "The view to expiate causes is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we attain salvation." So this is another one of those cases where we have no idea what's going on here until we look at the kanji. Because I looked at this and said, okay, causes, causes and conditions, what's this thing about? Attaining salvation, what do we mean? So you go and look at the kanji and you get a more complete translation perhaps of this gate would be something like having the prajna, or the wisdom that removes the source of the kleshas or the bonno or delusions, is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we gain the liberation of nirvana, or we become free from these delusive desires. So this word bonno, this Japanese word bonno, maybe you've come across it before. It refers to our delusive, kind of tempting, seductive desires. So this is the stuff that drives us to take unwholesome action or unskillful action. So it's not just mistaken views, it's not just desires. It's things that actually make us do something on the basis of that. So the problem isn't that we want food when we're hungry, or that we want the resources somehow to take care of our families, or those kinds of things. The problem starts when those desires are based on a clinging to self, and sort of not thoroughly understanding the nature of self. So that's where we start to go off the rails with this thing. So the Yogacara school of Buddhism, from which our Soto school descends, says that there are four basic bonno, four fundamental bonno, from which all our other problems, our other bonno, or other delusions arise. So the first one is gachi. Japanese word for this is gachi, which is ignorance of the nature of self, right? Ignorance of the three marks of existence as they relate to self. So interconnectedness, impermanence, egolessness. If we don't understand these things, we don't understand the nature of self, we have this first kind of bonno. So we think, I am this body, or I am this feeling, or I am this perception. And anything that isn't this, my body, my perception, my feeling is not me. Right? So somehow we don't understand interconnectedness. We think that there's some separation between this self and all the other myriad dharmas that we encounter. So we don't understand that the self can't exist without relation to other things, other beings, other elements in the universe. We don't understand that this self is subject to change, that there is no fixed permanent self that persists through time. All of this kind of misunderstanding is what this first bonno, gachi, is about. The second one is gaken, which is egocentric views that are based on our ignorance, or our clinging to our established views of the things around us, or the things that we encounter. So we look around at our world, we create a particular picture based on our perceptions. We think that the center of that world is me. So everything is, based on what I think, my perceptions, my views. Then on that basis, of course, we evaluate everything that we encounter for its relationship with us. So is it something I like? Is it something I don't like? Is it useful to me? Is it not valuable to me? Everything is based on, our evaluation of things, determined by, what about me? What's the relationship to me? What does it mean for the five skandhas? So that's a kind of a narrow view, right? If we're evaluating everything based on what's in it for me, it's a kind of a narrow view. It doesn't take into account what's actually happening around us for others. or what's actually happening in the larger dynamic functioning of this universe as a whole, this one unified reality. So it's really hard to get beyond our habituated thinking, right? This is the way, these are deeply ingrained habits. It makes intellectual sense for us to encounter everything, and have some perception, have some response based on what's in it for me. That's not an unusual thing. So it can be hard for us to see through and get past that habituated thinking around my point of view is the center of the universe. Everything that I encounter, the value of it is some value to me. So the third one is gamon. This is the third kind of bonno. Gamon is about having pride in ourselves, or the opposite, being having some shame about ourselves. What's our self-perception about our relative value in the world? So this is where we compare ourselves with other people, or with ourselves in other times, and we decide whether we're better or worse now than that. So I compare myself with you and say I'm a better or worse practitioner, or maybe I look back and say, boy, I've come a long way, or boy, have I really gone downhill. So I have, I'm evaluating myself against other beings, other times. If we think we're better today, or I'm better than you, then I'm happy. If I think somehow I'm not better today, or that you're better than me, now I'm worried about my inferiority. So again, I'm writing stories. Everything is in relation to what does this mean for my self-concept? What's my story about how I am today? The fourth kind of bonno is ga-I, or self-love, right? Everything we think or say or do shows how caught up we are in our own story, in our own self-involvement. So, how obsessed are we with everything we find pleasant, everything we find valuable, useful, fun, enjoyable, right? So these four are the basic kinds of bonno, the basic kinds of this seductive, thirsting desire that causes us to take some action, which might be unskillful or unwholesome. So the ga in the beginning of each of these four words is actually I or me, but what it's referring to is the Atman. So maybe you know this term, the Atman. In pre-Buddhist India, there was a sort of a lower self and a higher self. So the lower self was the impermanent part, the body, the personality, the impermanent part of I or me. Then there was also a higher self, which had some kind of permanent essence. There was, that's the soul, that's the Atman, right? So there was two kinds of self, but the higher self was seen to be permanent, right? There was a permanent essence there. So the Buddhist teaching about anatman, no fixed permanent self, the an being, no, right? So no atman, no fixed permanent self. That's a distinguishing characteristic, right, from the Hinduism or the Vedic tradition that came before the Buddha. So he's making a break from that, saying that there isn't that higher permanent fixed self. There is nothing we can point to and say, this is permanent about this self. So instead of a permanent self, there's only this changing collection of elements, right? This changing collection of 5 skandhas. It comes together for a while. There's some energy there that holds it together. Eventually, it can't hold itself together anymore, and it falls apart. It comes apart, right? So this self is not permanent. It arises based on causes and conditions. It changes based on causes and conditions. And then somehow it doesn't hold together anymore, again, based on these changing causes and conditions. So all of these 4 kinds of bonno, or delusive desire, have some connection to being self-involved, probably self-involved to the exclusion of a broader worldview, right? An exclusion of seeing the larger universe or this one unified reality. It's very difficult to see beyond me or my experience of the world and what I think I need, and what things are doing in relation to me. So in the second bodhisattva vow, bonno mujin segandan. Bonno that's the bonno we're talking about. Bonno mujin segandan. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. So so in this case, again, delusions is worldly cares, sensual desire, passions, longings for things in an unfortunate kind of unwholesome way, suffering, pain, all of this stuff is what goes with bonno. So as we know, delusion is not a simple thing, right? We live with delusion and thirsting desire and all these kind of seductive temptations every day. So we know it's not one thing. It's not simple. These things are complicated and there's a lot of them. So one word is kind of not enough to convey all of the teachings, about this bonno, all the complexity of bonno. So we can see why delusions are inexhaustible, right? This bodhisattva vow makes a lot of sense. They're just seems like there's no end to these bonno, because look at everything they cover, right? So the first kanji, if you look at the word bonno itself, the first kanji of that is about troubles, worries, vexations, concerns, afflictions, annoyances, right? Things that are troublesome, bothersome, things that get in the way. It has a feeling of sort of being noisy or fussy or distracting, right? Something that's clamoring for our attention is this first part of bonno. And the second kanji gives this feeling of seductiveness or being enchanted with, right? Something we yearn for, something we long for in ways that are maybe not so smart, not so skillful, not so wise. So there are the sufferings that are, born from our desires. We want things even though we know they won't help in the long term, right? This is kind of basic to our delusion. We want things because we don't understand the nature of self. We think that, well, if I just have the sexier partner or the bigger power boat or the better job or, the nicer house, somehow I will be happy. This small self will somehow be fulfilled. And, when we start practicing and we start listening to the Buddha's teachings in an intellectual way, we know that's not going to work. I know that if I go get that belonging that I really want, or if somehow, I have the life circumstances in this moment that feel like I'm getting what I need, in the next moment, something's going to change. So we know intellectually it's not ultimately what's going to lead to contentment. And yet those things are just so seductive, right? They're just so desirable. We just want things just like potato chips, right? They seem desirable. We eat them. They're crunchy, they're salty. They taste good, but they don't really provide nourishment, right? It's not actually a meal. The salt makes us thirsty, right? Pretty soon we want more, or we want something else. A short time later, we're hungry again. Maybe this time we're looking for real food. Maybe this time we're moving on to popcorn or chocolate or something else. But those potato chips are easy. They taste good. In this moment, they feel satisfying. But in the long term, we know, that's it's not enough, right? So bonno has this feeling of temptation. We suffer because we're tempted by the things to which we are attached. We've all got attachments. It's the nature of this human condition. We want to grab things, right? We're tempted by those things. Even though we know we're going to suffer because of them, somehow we can't quite let go, right? We can't resist. So, we set up some patterns in our habituated thinking, in our habituated activity. Well, whenever I indulge in internet shopping or I overindulge in internet shopping, I have trouble because I can't pay my bills. And yet, I just can't resist buying that pair of shoes or that new jacket or that, new computer or whatever it is we're buying. I really want that new video game. Somehow, maybe this time, that won't be a problem. Well, if we look at the content of our thinking, it's not going to work. Why is this not going to be a problem when it's been a problem every other time? So this is one kind of delusion, right? This kind of compulsion or our habituated thinking. We do the same things over and over. Somehow we don't accept the result. We just don't accept that we're setting ourselves up for some suffering, or at least we're not moving towards a wholesome kind of contentedness. And we keep doing it, even though we know better, we keep doing it. So, by the way, there's another Japanese word which is related to this, or sometimes it's used for delusion, and that word is mayoi. In Buddhism, it means Maya. It means the illusion of thinking that somehow duality is the real nature of things. It's somehow our ability to ignore non-separation. This word mayoi also is an everyday Japanese word, and it has a feeling of being lost. It's like, we hesitate, we're bewildered because we've lost our way. And we've, in a way, we've kind of lost touch with reality. If reality is non-separation and we've lost touch with that, we've become bewildered and lost. And this is what mayoi is about. So it's a kind of a related aspect, a related term. So we've become deluded. We believe in things that contradict reality. If we see reality clearly, we see that, our habituated thinking has led us astray, but somehow, we managed to not do that. So, of course, it's because of our ignorance. And if you look at ignorance, it's got the same root as ignore, right? So it's like somehow in here, we've got the prajna, we've got the wisdom. We can see, if we look clearly, what our habits are, and yet we choose to ignore them, and we have ignorance, right? So it's a helpful pairing there. So this delusion that comes from ignorance is this first kind of bono, right? So most of our delusions are this ignorant kind. They are based on ignorance. So the way to get rid of them, of course, is to cultivate some kind of deep understanding of the Four Noble Truths, because that is the description of the nature of reality. We have suffering in this human form, all right? Our suffering is caused by our clinging and our attachment and our grasping for these, seductive things. There is a way to turn that around, and that way is following the Eightfold Path. So that's, a good description of reality. So if we can deeply cultivate an understanding of how that works, about those Four Noble Truths, we begin to manifest the kind of prajna that we already have and that we need to break this cycle of clinging and craving and chasing, and right? So anytime we're in error about the nature of reality, anytime we don't understand the nature of reality, then we really can't be our true selves. We're being a self which we've created out of our delusive thinking, out of our temptations and our desires, which is not the real us, right? That's, we're not fully manifesting Buddha nature. We're not fully manifesting awakening. We're manifesting our delusion. So in order to be fully awake, we have to completely understand how things really are, how things really work, before we paper them over with our ideas and stories and concepts and habituated thinking. If there is the slightest deviation, the slightest misunderstanding, then there's some delusion there. We're not able to exist in pure awareness. We're not able to move through the world from a basis of our awakening, our prajna, our wisdom, right? So delusion is just our ignorance of the true nature of things. Either we don't understand, or we do understand and we choose to ignore, which is kind of our human condition. So regardless of the form they take, these delusions obstruct our ability to manifest our Buddha nature. So, this kind of delusion is really subtle. It's pervasive. Its roots are quite deep. It motivates us to think and act in certain ways. And when we think and act in certain ways, we set up some causes and conditions. We set up some patterns that become kind of self-reinforcing, right? There's a cycle of this thinking and action. And we know, how do we create karma? Body, speech, and mind. So it starts with our thinking. Maybe we say things, we take action based on that. We reinforce this delusion. So there's this, sort of moving through this cycle of delusion. So again, important to look carefully and understand the Four Noble Truths. How do we break that cycle? How do we break that chain, right? If we don't, we have suffering in this phenomenal world, because we're moving through the world without actually seeing what's going on. What we're seeing is what we're projecting. We're seeing our own stories. We're not seeing reality. Once that train is kind of headed down the track, it's kind of tough to pull it back, right? Practice, we know, is not a one-time thing. We take bodhisattva vows. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them, and we know we'll never get to the end. We take that vow knowing those delusions are going to keep arising. We're going to keep encountering them. We're going to keep stumbling over them. And yet somehow we aspire and we take that vow. So it's said that there are 108 bono that in this human condition we need to overcome in order to reach nirvana. And so, the second part of this gate statement says, if we have the prajna to see how bono arise, that's how we become liberated. That's how we reach nirvana or exist in nirvana. So supposedly there's 108 of these things that we need to overcome or recognize or work with. So there are some physical ways that this 108 kind of manifests, which can serve as reminders for us. Temples and shrines, if you go to a temple or a shrine in Japan, there are often 108 steps to get to the top, right? So also in Japan at New Year, we have the temple bell that rings out 108 times. There's a ritual called Joya no Kane, which is literally protecting night bell. So this is a bell that rings 108 times, and it's about protecting us from delusion. It's about driving out these 108 bonno. So 107 of those bells have a year that's going out, and the 108th happens at midnight. So somehow as we cross over from an old year into a new year, this bell is helping us not to take our delusion with us into the new year. So there's one other traditional explanation about ringing that bell 108 times, which is, so bear with me because there's a little bit of Japanese that happens here. So there's an expression, shikuhaku, and shikuhaku means to be in dire distress or to have some difficulty. So this is about the suffering that happens when we're caught up in these delusions. Shikuhaku means we are struggling, we are suffering in this life. It has, that word has the same sound as the numbers 4, 9, 8, 9. Shikuhaku, right? 4, 9, 8, 9. So if you add up 4 times 9 and 8 times 9, it comes out to be 108. So that's where we get this calculation, right? It's kind of mixed up with this idea about we have suffering, we have delusion, shikuhaku, and 108 delusions and 108 rings, right? So the bell, maybe you've been to a Japanese temple, but the boncho, the bell, is not like up in a really high tower like it would be in a Christian cathedral or something. It's on the, the bell tower is on the ground, or at most maybe it's up 1 story, right? It has to be close to people, because you have to be able to be sort of next to it or in the vicinity of it when it rings for that sound to be a purifying, cleansing kind of thing. The idea is like that sound is like water that's washing over us and cleansing us, right, of these delusion, of these bonno. So that sound is something that takes away our troubles, but we have to be in the vicinity of it, right? And I don't know if you've ever stood next to one of these big bells, but you feel it in your body. That's a deep vibration. If you're ringing it, it's one thing, but even to stand in the vicinity, there's a cleansing that feels like it's happening there. So this physical act of ringing the bell 108 times, or being next to that bell, or walking up those steps, 108 steps to the temple, is a kind of a body practice to symbolically eliminate all of these bonno. So if you are interested in body practice, into body practice, you may have some feeling about that as you're doing those things. So of course, it would be great if removing the causes of these bonno, it would be as easy as climbing the stairs or standing next to the bell or ringing the bell. But we know from the Bodhisattva vows that our practice is never finished, and somehow those bonno keep coming back in some form or other. Desires keep coming back. So as this gate says, having the prajna, or the wisdom that removes the source of these bonno, is how we find nirvana, how we free ourselves from these delusive desires. So willpower or aspiration or intention is a good thing. It's probably not enough, right? Because the roots of these things are so deep that they will keep coming back. If we don't pull out the root, the plant keeps regrowing. Somehow that delusion keeps regrowing. So in order to do that, we need to understand how those delusions arise in the first place. And if we're going to find nirvana, we have to understand also that our deluded samsaric day-to-day world is not different from nirvana, right? It's not that we have to go somewhere else. Here's nirvana right here. So we need the prajna to really get what that means, to really have some insight into what that actually means. So as I've mentioned several times, there are numberless bonno, delusions. They arise in so many forms, in so many ways. And because of that, it can feel like we're just fighting a fire on so many fronts. It's like every time we turn around, we're confronted with some kind of bonno. Maybe it's ours. Maybe it's my neighbor's, maybe it's somebody else's, maybe it's the society as a whole. It's like there's this delusion and this one and this one and this one, and they're mine and other people's, and my goodness, there are so many of them. So in writing about bonno, Uchiyama Roshi said, which desire is considered the worst hindrance has differed depending on time and place. In ancient India, people thought the most troublesome obstacle for practitioners was sexual desire. They made strong efforts to control such desires. Later in Shobogenzo Gyoji, Dogen Zenji said the desire for fame is worse than violating the precepts. He considered pursuing fame and profit the greatest hindrance to practice, probably because in his time, Monks in Nara and on Mount Koya and Mount Hiei competed with each other for wealth and renown. Sexual greed and desire for fame and profit are all obstacles that should be renounced by practitioners of the Buddha way. So he's focusing here on, on several kinds of the many, many kinds of desires. By the way, when he's referring to monks in Nara and Mount Koya and Mount Hiei, he's talking about different kinds of Japanese Buddhism, right? So all of these monks are competing for fame, competing for renown, and Dogen Zenji is saying that's worse than breaking precepts. Getting caught up in that need to shore up self is worse than breaking precepts. So, which bono is afflicting us at any given time is going to change given causes and conditions are changing all the time. So today I'm afflicted by one, tomorrow I'm afflicted by another. Just like we move through the Rokudo, right, the 6 realms of samsara, we're also sort of bouncing from desire to desire, from illusion to delusion, right? There are lots of them. The important thing is that all of these delusions in their various forms have a shared starting point. This is something, the Buddha explained to us. We can look to 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas. We can look to self, our ideas about self, and wanting to cling to some story about self, is as the root of these delusive desires. This is really deeply held, right? We spend our whole lives writing this story. And here's the starting point for all of these 108. And by the way, 108, you've encountered 108 before in this tradition. It's just another word for numberless. Interestingly, if you look at the kanji for 8, it looks like a kind of a triangle with an open, the base is open. So it's this open-endedness, right? This is what it's pointing to. There's an open-ended number of desires. They just keep coming around. Okay, but the starting point for all of them, the commonality for all of them, the first place we get stuck is getting stuck on this, right? What is this self? What's the story around self? So Hojo-san says about this, Buddha accessed the source or foundation of our delusions, which is clinging to the self. Each one of us has different kinds of delusions and different kinds of hindrances or problems, but the basis of all of those problems is the same. That basis is self-clinging or ignorance about the self and ignorance about interconnectedness. That is the way Buddha sees our delusion, and he taught how to become free from them. Buddha didn't know what kind of delusions I have, but he gave me the way to practice so that I can become free from these problems. So this is related to the first bodhisattva vow as well, right? Beings are numberless, I vowed to free them. So we don't know what everybody's delusions are. I don't know what yours are. You don't know what mine are. And yet, we have some aspiration to overcome desires for ourselves and all beings. So we don't know what others are clinging to. We hardly know what we're clinging to. We can't free other people specifically, most of the time, from their delusions. And yet, as bodhisattvas, this is what we're vowing to do. So it's like, how do we even begin to approach this thing? There are so many delusions. We don't know what everybody's delusions are. And yet, we're vowing to overcome all of this. So, Buddha and Uchiyama Roshi and Hojo-san are saying, look to the source of this, which is not understanding self. We can start right there. So, I can't go in and free you from your specific delusion, but what I can do as a bodhisattva is to share practice, is to share the Dharma in some skillful way. That doesn't mean I'm going to stand on the street corner and exhort everybody to sit zazen. But if I can move through the world in a skillful way, if I can act based on understanding the nature of self and how reality works, that is how we skillfully share the Dharma and move people toward understanding interconnectedness, cause and effect, and all of those things, right? So this is how, if we can be skillful and appropriate in our own lives, it's an important way of sharing Dharma and beginning to point away from perhaps some of these delusions. So Hojo-san goes on to say, you have to work for yourself to become free from your personal delusions. We cannot release other people from their delusions, but we can share how the Buddha practiced and how other practitioners or teachers practice and become released from their own delusions. I received the teaching from my teacher, and that is what I'm trying to share with people. So again, we don't have to be dragging people into the zendo, but can we be skillful? Can we model how to live from an awakened place? How can we model how to be bodhisattvas? So Sawaki Roshi, I think, was getting at something related to this with all of his teachings about group stupidity. And we've talked about group stupidity here before, right? You know, I think it's one important way that we and others get caught up in these bonno, right? We can catch them from each other in a particular way. If we get sort of caught up in what is the group doing? So this is about being swept along by what others are saying, what others are doing, what other people expect us to do, what we think other people value, what they want us to, how they want us to be in the world. Maybe it's because we feel like we want to belong, right? There's all these ways that we get swept up in group stupidity. When we do that, we either become paralyzed, we're unable to take the skillful action we know we need to take, or we fall into doing unskillful things because that's what everybody's doing, right? So this is what Sawaki Roshi is talking about when he's talking about group stupidity. So Uchiyama Roshi had a comment about this. He said, when Sawaki coined the expression group stupidity, he was speaking of hindrances not only for Buddhist practitioners, but for everyone in this modern age. So Sawaki Roshi is talking, you know, to his own students and his own sangha, but of course he's speaking broadly, right? We see there's bonno out there that go way beyond anybody who professes to practice Buddhism. So he's looking broadly at the result of bonno in the larger society, as well as the impact on individual suffering. So as bodhisattvas, how can we liberate ourselves and others and all beings from this bonno related to group stupidity? It's kind of a live question for us today, right? So this is, you know, not something that's easy to resolve. So when it comes to finding nirvana in the midst of these bonno, it is not about waiting until we've extinguished all of our own delusive desires and then transporting ourselves somewhere out of here, right? It's not about getting to a perfect place, because there is no perfect place. So Menzan Zuiho, I've talked about him before. He lived from 1683 to 1769, so he's considerably later than Dogen. Now we're moving into another era. He's an important teacher in Soto history. He was heavily involved with a reform movement. They tried to tie all of the practice activities going on in Soto Zen back to Dogen's actual writings, Dogen's actual teachings. So he was all about rooting out anything he thought had been corrupted from what Dogen originally taught. Now, what did Dogen originally teach? That's open to interpretation. So there was a lot of kind of turmoil around this reform movement, but this is what he was doing. So he wrote about this expression, Kyakujin Bonno, which is delusive desires are dust from the outside, right? Kyakujin Bonno, delusive desires are dust from the outside. This is an expression, right? So that's how Hojo-san translates this Japanese expression. Delusive desires are dust from the outside. So here's what Menzan has to say about this. Original mind is like the keeper of an inn, and the various kinds of thoughts are like visitors coming and going. When one visitor leaves, another one comes. Each visitor is different from the others. Some belong to high society and others belong to the lower class. Some are rich and others are poor, but the keeper is always the same. So he's talking about all these delusions, right? Various kinds of delusions. Or when sunlight streams into a room through a window and you hit a straw mat, you will see dust rising up in clouds. After the dust settles, there is nothing but empty space. In this analogy, thoughts are the rising dust and original mind is the empty space. From ancient times, there have been many commentators who have carelessly misinterpreted this analogy. They have thought that a rising mind is just Kyakujin Bonno. That is, delusion is like a dust that sticks to our mind. Therefore, they have thought Munen Mushin, no thought, no mind, is our true original mind. They have insisted on trying to eliminate thoughts by force. So he's making a picture. He says we can imagine original mind is here and thoughts are coming and going, delusions are coming and going like visitors, or we can imagine we hit this mat, dust arises, somehow the dust settles, the dust is the thinking, the delusive thoughts, and there's empty space, which is the original mind. So he's drawing these pictures. He's saying that's all well and good, but that's been misinterpreted for years. So to think that these things are separate is actually a misunderstanding. So he says this is a mistaken view. It happens because people don't understand that bonno, or delusion, and original mind, or awakening, are not actually separate. Right? So customers and keeper, or dust and empty space, are not actually separate. Delusions, he's saying, are just another form of original mind. Delusions and awakening, not separate. So this is now familiar territory, right? This is starting to sound like things we've encountered before. It's just another way to say samsara and nirvana are not two. This samsaric world of delusion and Karmic conditions and all the things we encounter is not actually separate from nirvana. Nirvana is not somewhere out there. It's right here. So because, we know this human condition, because of the Four Noble Truths, we know this human condition is tied up with delusion. We can't get rid of all of our delusion, and yet nirvana is already here. So we need the prajna to understand that whole circumstance. So there's another expression in the Mahayana tradition, which is Bonno Soku Bodai, which is that Bonno themselves are awakening. Bonno Soku Bodai, Bodai, right? Awakening. These delusions themselves are awakening. There is no real separation. So working with our delusions, working with our desires, is itself the practice, right? We know, we get on the cushion, delusions are there. So, being with those things actually is the practice. We're not trying to get to somewhere else. So rather than closing ourselves off from the world and separating ourselves from what's going on around us, we're practicing as bodhisattvas right in the middle of Bonno. They're not going to go anywhere. And yet somehow nirvana is already here. So can we transform our desires, our delusive desires that are based on small self and misunderstanding of the small self? And can we turn that? Can we transform that into something which is liberating? Can we liberate all beings from suffering? Can we use our karmic conditions to transcend our karmic conditions, right? This is what bodhisattvas do. Can we see our desires and use those somehow in a transformative way? So, if we can do that, we're working on general well-being. We're working on our own well-being, but we're working on general well-being too. It's not just about I'm uncomfortable. If I can do some transforming there, if I can see through my desires, if I can if I can be in touch with the prajna, the wisdom, the insight, right? These delusions loosen their grip. So when this gate says we need to have the prajna to see how Bonno arise, then we can be liberated from them or see through them a little bit and enter nirvana. I think there's two ways to look at that, right? One is we need to see how self-attachment in one form or another is at the root of just about all of our Bonno, right? We need to see clearly about that whole thing and how that starts, how that, moves us towards some unwholesomeness. The other thing we need to see is that nirvana is not separate from our delusion and suffering, right? And that we're already there. So we don't need to eliminate these deluded thoughts by force. This is what Menzon is saying. He's saying people have persisted on trying to eliminate these thoughts by force. It's not that we need to push them out, because we know in our Zazen, if these thoughts are arising, whatever the thoughts are, our practice is not grab them, but it's also not forcibly push them away. Because if we're doing that, we're engaging with them. And as soon as we engage with them, we have separation. Now we have me and a thought, and I'm thinking a thought. As soon as I let go, I don't poke my head in. I don't grab that thought. I don't engage with that thought. There isn't me thinking something. There is just thinking happening, right? So he's coming back to this whole practice about we're not labeling delusions as bad and forcing them out. We're seeing them arise. We're having some insight into what's going on, but we're not engaging with them. We're not taking action based on them. So delusion then can begin to dissolve on its own, right? It begins to loosen its grip on us a little bit, kind of on its own, when we understand how that all arises from five skandhas clinging to five skandhas. So, as that's happening, whatever delusion is there is still a manifestation of original mind, a manifestation of awakening. It's not separate from this one unified reality. So sometimes we can use wisdom as another word for prajna, but we know this is not wisdom we learn from books. This is not intellectual wisdom. This is direct insight into what the Buddha taught. This is insight into Buddha's Dharma. What did he teach about the nature of reality and the nature of self and how these things interact, how these five skandhas come together and somehow start clinging to themselves, as Hojo-san would say. How do these five skandhas sort of look at five skandhas and start to cling to themselves? And out of that, we have the entire chain of causation, right? We have the entire story about what happens with self. So when we can see clearly, that's prajna. That's the wisdom we need to work with these bonno. That's when we get to stop being pulled around by our attachments, and by our cravings and aversions, and stop creating the karma that goes with all of this. And then we can see Nirvana is here. It's not separate from us. We've sort of already arrived in that way, right? So I'm going to stop here talking about Bono and ask you what you would like to say about anything from this morning or the things that are happening in your practice. Sagan's already got a hand up. Please jump in.
Yeah, at the beginning of your talk, I think were mentioning 4 basic Bono, and I was kind of curious about the Japanese terms. I got 3 of them, but I think I missed the first one. I have ga-ken, ga-mon, and ga-ai.
Right. The first one is gachi.
Gachi.
Right. Ignorance of the nature of self, or ignorance of 3 marks of existence as they relate to self.
Oh, so the chi means
I don't have the kanji in front of me. I'm guessing it's related to ignorance, but I have to look it up specifically. Okay. I didn't take the kanji and put them here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second one, I think, or the third one you mentioned was ga-mon.
Ga-mon.
Is that something like pride, maybe?
Yes.
Mon. Okay.
Yeah. So we have gachi, ga-ken. Ken is about seeing. Ga-mon, and ga-ai. I is literally love.
Right.
Self-love.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to get those details. Yeah. Thanks.
You can find about these. You can find kanjis for these. They're not so uncommon. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other things people would like to say or ask? And don't forget to unmute. Sawyer, did I see you waving? Kata's waving there. It's Sawyer and then Kata.
I was just expanding the view.
Okay. Kata, you had something to say.
Hoko, you were talking about one of the delusions as being seeing the self as the center from which we evaluate relationships and objects with this kind of an acquisitive mind. What's in it for me? And I find it such a compressed way and an elegant way to trace some of the difficulties that we experience in relationships and in our lives. And I think sometimes I think about a move away from that place that could be something on the lines of seeing the context rather than seeing the self, rather than the center, more as a context of our lives, rather a little bit more diffused rather than the singularity of a center from which we attend with a sense of compassion, with a sense of engagement with the mundane life, the relationships that we have, right? And I find that it's a practice that often grounds me, you know, just to kind of attend to what needs to be done, you know, without always filtering through the center, the self there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We can't ignore the self. The self is a part of this one unified reality, but it's not the whole story. And it's so easy to think, you know, this is the whole world. So if we can kind of put the self over here, and as you say, you know, it's kind of the context for what's happening. So we can have a much broader view. Because the reality is there's something happening which is bigger than this little 5 skandhas. And so we're actually not seeing reality if we're only seeing our own perception, right? So to be able to step back and say what else is happening and see a broader view certainly means we act more skillfully. And I suspect we don't, it's another way to not get quite so caught up in our own suffering. You know, because if this isn't the only thing that's happening and I can see something broader, it's like, phew, I can, you know, get out of my little kind of hole that I'm in. So yeah, I think it's helpful for us as individuals and also helps us take broader action. So I think your description is right on. Sagan.
Yeah, just as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think in mathematical terms and say, maybe the small self is like a subset and it's part of a superset. Huh?
Yeah, kind of. Well, or we're back to, you know, 1 = 0 = infinity, right? Yeah, so it's part of the story and it's an important part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And I think that's the hole we fall into, is we think this is the whole story. You know, we've probably all had some experience where we're pretty sure we see what's going on, and then a friend comes along and says, but did you think about this piece? And you go, oh my gosh, I never even thought about that. And it changes your entire perception of that circumstance. Oh my gosh, if I could just step kind of out of my story, there's a whole other thing happening here, or a whole other set of information that I didn't have, that I didn't see. It was right here, right? So yeah. What would others like to say? Hennesis, please.
Just a quick question. I'm trying to look up the concept of bono, and I don't know if I'm spelling it wrong or whatnot. What are the Chinese characters in it? Like, what do they literally mean?
It's two. There's two N's. B-O-N-N-O. It's Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
So the first kanji is about troubles, worries, vexations, things that ni, and the second kanji is this feeling of seductiveness or being enchanted by something. Yeah, bono is a very common term. You can look it up in like Buddhist dictionaries, or you won't have any trouble finding it.
Okay, and it's a double N?
Double N, bono. B-O-N is the first phoneme and N-O is the second.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Lots of literary folks here today. Linguistic, that's the word I want. Lots of linguistics folks today. Other questions, comments, reflections about self-delusions? Hoshin, please.
Yes, a little bit of a comment, I guess. This feels like a really timely gate. And the reason I want to say that is that this is a gate more about the tension, I feel, between the constant feeling of dissatisfaction and accepting the moment perfect as it is. It's like if we can accept the fact that, okay, we have this virus floating around in public, if we do the right things, our suffering will decrease. It's kind of the same thing. Also, thinking of Zazen itself, this practice that we do, as an opportunity to break the habits of mind. It's why we do what we do. So finding our way into the temple, sitting at home, whatever, breaking those habits of mind that keep us from experiencing the moment as it is.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So for your first point, boy, you couldn't be more right. If we can look beyond our immediate, as difficult as this is in the midst of pandemic fatigue, which is like, what a term, pandemic fatigue. If we can look beyond our own sort of immediate discomfort, dissatisfaction, frustration, we've all got it. I mean, I would love for all of us to be sitting in the temple. I'm not there. This is a picture. I am incredibly frustrated that I can't get all of you together. I have to look beyond that. And if we can continue to do the right thing, do the social distancing, do the masking, I hate masks as much as the next person, but yeah, can I look beyond my story? The reality is there's a virus, we need to do something about that. And certainly I agree, Zazen is a wonderful place to get in touch with some of these teachings and to get in touch with this gate, because as thoughts arise, thoughts about self, and that's, where everything starts, those thoughts arise and we don't cling to them. We don't have to be anybody when we're sitting Zazen. There's no self there. There's Zazen sitting Zazen. So it's a wonderful opportunity to really be in the middle of that, right? To know what that feels like and to have some insight into how that works. Yeah, that's one of the many reasons Zazen is core to our tradition, right? It's not about destroying self, right? It's not about I shouldn't have any self-identity at all, because we know we can't move through the world without some sense of self. We need to have some mental health around this thing, right? And at the same time, we need to see clearly itself as provisional. We need to not cling too closely to the idea of self. I kind of think so when we encounter these teachings about self, right now, I'm teaching a class at Ivy Tech, and just our last week, we talked about the whole idea of no self. And I said, that can feel scary. If Buddha's telling us there's no self, that, well, golly, that feels like annihilation. I mean, that doesn't feel good. So on the one hand, if we look at it that way, yeah, it's kind of scary. Why? Because we're still clinging to our, ideas about self. If we look at it from another side, though, it means the things about myself where I feel stuck, or the things I'm not so happy about, it's like, those are not constant. Those are not permanent. I can let go of those things. If I have some bad habit, if I'm doing something unskillful, if I'm creating unhappiness for myself, guess what, folks? There's a way out. I don't have to keep perpetuating that. If I can see what I'm doing, I don't have to keep perpetuating that. So, Four Noble Truths, I think, are incredibly encouraging, because they help us see, how are we setting ourselves up with our delusion and our, this seductive temptation. There's a way out of that, and it's achievable. Maybe it's in small ways, but it's achievable. So I think it's incredibly encouraging. What would others like to say? Comments, questions, reflections? Mark, please.
So big question here.
Oh, I'm afraid of you.
As you're talking, and as we're talking about self and self, one of the thoughts that comes to my mind is that, me literally using my I, we have a sense of identity comes up with ego and I, and question is, so as we get rid of the self, where do we place identity? Or more accurately, where is identity placed?
So I would be careful about a phrase like getting rid of self, because we're not getting rid of self. Self is a part of this one unified reality. It's simply not the whole story. So our identity is, I understand this is 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas. I understand that this is an impermanent collection of elements. I understand that it's interconnected with everything else. It doesn't have any fixed and permanent, essence. So if I understand the nature of self, I can still have some identity. Because I identify as, this is a small self, and there's there's an individual self and a universal self. So I don't think we get rid of self, and I don't think we get rid of identity and personality and all of that. I think we just see it clearly for what it is. So if if my identity is tied up with who I think I am, and now I see clearly who I actually am, I think we don't not have identity. I think our understanding changes. But I'm interested in what others would have to say about that. What do others think about Mark's question? And Jeff, maybe I'll turn to you as somebody who's in the field. As somebody who works with psychology, do you have any insights there? And if you don't, Kata, I'll come to you after Jeff.
I'm trying to unmute.
Yeah, you're fine. I hear you.
I am. Okay. Well, Mark's question really grabbed me because it just so happens that in one of my academic settings, I've been dogged for a long time about what identity is. It's been really, really irking me, because it shouldn't. It's undeniable that it has an enormous power in people's lives, and I don't know any setting in which there's an adequate explanation of it, and people just accept it in the academic world and use it and refer to it, and I'm just speechless watching these things go on. So I think Sagan's comment earlier about self and context, and I've been playing with that since he said that about identity as well as being a kind of diffuse context.
Okay. And Kata, you're in the field as well. You wanted to jump in.
I find that when I think about identity, often I go to the self story, the stories we tell ourselves, and it doesn't take a lot of practice to see how limited those stories are. And I find that I don't know, the alternative that I like to engage with is to kind of let loose a little bit some of those self stories and see what happens. See how the rest of the world kind of comes to reshape the story of the self, while when we are a little bit more permeable, when those stories about who we are not so rigid, so self-defining, and we have contact with different sources of the self, right? Natural, social. I don't know, it's a very powerful question, but it seems to me like I don't have a clear answer, but it's for me a direction that sometimes pulls me to let go a little bit of the power of the self story, the verbal self story, who I am and what I am. And in the process, something comes in, that might be a little bit less verbal, less conceptual, but a little bit more flexible and more expansive.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think, and Tennesis, I see you, and Hoshin, I see you too. I think we have to have some understanding about maybe what identity means, right? So do we see the real self, or do we see the self that we've kind of written the story about? So Hennesis, you, and then Hoshin.
Okay, sorry, I was struggling to unmute. So maybe I'm not answering this question properly, and I know as someone who brings up Western philosophy a lot, you're probably familiar with this, but I often think about this a lot in relationships when the self comes up, but sort of like Hegel's idea of a society of recognition, the idea that there is no atomized self, and our concept of self only exists because other people imprints that onto us. And so I guess oftentimes when I'm thinking about like the concept of like how to get rid of the self, it's more like, what is the self in context? Like, since, like myself is only sort of what I see myself in relationship to others. If I think of the self in that way, it's kind of this way of destroying the self while also recognizing that the self exists because of interconnectedness, I guess, is sort of how I often think about this. I'm not sure if that answers what you were thinking of, but that's what came to mind.
Well, and again, I think we have to be careful with terms like getting rid of self or destroying self. Small self exists. Nobody's trying to get rid of that. What we need to do is see it clearly. Hoshin, you wanted to jump back in.
Yeah, years ago when I first started practicing, I forget someplace I read, and something about as we practice, we become more porous.
Mm.
So the idea of being, as we become more porous, we're able to see that solid self more clearly and also understand what makes us porous. So that just kind of comes back to the idea of what prajna and prajna wisdom is. Understanding emptiness is prajna wisdom, and incorporating that into how we engage the world, constantly exposing what that porosity is to ourselves. See where we're able to flow constantly that way. So that was just my comment.
Yeah, so I think that's not unrelated to what Kata was saying about flexibility. So maybe what's happening is our identity, part of our identity is that we can be more flexible, right? We can have a more flexible understanding of who and what this is. Mark, do you want to follow up on any of that or jump back in? It's a great question. Thank you for opening up that whole thing for us. That's an interesting thing to discuss.
Yeah, the joy of sitting. One of the things I find interesting is, like, I'm currently reading a book, and the first argument is, hey, there's reality out there. We're not stuck inside ourselves within the Cartesian cogito. I think, therefore I am. We don't just have ideas and rationalize what it's like. Try to think about what the world is really like. We know what the world is by interacting with it. And I leave my question my question in general is about identity in general, because as we talk, as we're talking, we kind of conflate the idea of I with the world. And what I find interesting is that when we do talk about identity, we are also talking about the the existential universe as we know it, not even necessarily existential, just the universe. When we, I'm relating to a screen right now, but I'm relating to people that are out there in the real world. And, there's a certain sense of identity there. And Hennesis, I find it quite funny because I find my practice to be quite Hegelian in general. As you sit, the universe practices itself. Hegelian logic at its finest. So yeah, I think these are all good. I think these are all good questions, or all good responses. But it's still something to chew on.
Sure, absolutely. Well, so many of these questions that arise, don't have easy answers, but it's useful to throw them out there because they stimulate our thinking and help us, open up some new view that we didn't have before, right? Other comments, questions? Sagan, please.
I think in terms of this notion of, being very flexible in our identity, I think maybe in my own experience, I've kind of experienced that in the area of like, studying different languages, living in Spain, living in France, and realizing that my identity as an American was very porous, very, flexible. I mean, I could change, I could adopt a different kind of perspective, not just in terms of the language, but the cultural assumptions of the place. And so at that point, you start to realize that identity is very, very supple, can be very flexible.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm sure we've all been in situations where we realize we are one way, in one circumstance and one way in another. I have frequently said when I get to Japan and I'm in that culture, my body language changes, my tone of voice changes, I'm adapting to what's around me. I'm, I'm still me, but I'm a different version of me. So yeah, having some flexibility about that is interesting. So I think, Mark, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, but also in the contrast to all of this, when we're talking about identity and when we're talking about flexibility, there's also a certain sense that we bring up certain things that go beyond contextual. We talk about mathematics, and the Western side has idealized mathematics as a fundamental form, to where there's a certain sense where identity goes beyond the context and transcends it all. So I find this all, I find the question to be kind of a false question, because like Hoja-san's 1 equals 0 equals infinity. Underlying this, you have the equal sign, you have an aspect of mathematics, set theory even, and it plays into that. And so you have this, I find this interesting because you have this idea of a oneness, but then also in understanding this oneness, you have the contextualization kind of floating away that takes away the oneness. So this is a good question.
It's a really good question. And I think it's a great example about how we ask the questions and ultimately we have to let go of even the questions. Because again, we're dealing with language, and language has, it puts boundaries around stuff. And pretty soon the questions don't work anymore. We back out far enough and even the words in the questions don't make sense. And this is not, somehow recently I've had this happen like 2 or 3 times. People have asked questions under various circumstances. And ultimately, the question doesn't work. So, it's a finger pointing to the moon, and it opens up an interesting discussion. And at some point, even we let go of that. Did I see another hand up someplace? I thought I saw somebody waving at me. I don't want to cut people off. Anybody else? Risa, yes. I can't hear you. You got to unmute yourself. Because I think.
Okay. I'm not used to doing this yet, so. I really, really like Kata's formulation about thinking of the self as the context rather than the center. And I find it almost impossible to not think of myself as the center. It's really, really difficult. And I just wanted to share something that I have found that helps me a lot, which is, for example, if I'm on a walk and other people are going past, I look at a person and I say, that person is the center of the universe. And that immediately jars me out of my own usual self-concept, self-perception. So if I can just keep doing that and keep looking at others and realizing everyone thinks he or she is the center of the universe. And if I just think, well, that person is, I'm not. And some years ago, I was in the car, I had the radio on, and a song came on by, I've never been able to find this again, but it was I believe it was something of a gospel group or a Christian folk group. Anyway, they sang a song, and in the song, the words were, I think I'm the center of the universe. You think you're the center of the universe, but God made a sparrow the center of the universe.
What a great tangible example of Indra's net, right? If we can, each person we meet or each Dharma we encounter, if we can go, that has just as much of a right to be the center of the universe as this does, then it kind of reminds us, we've got Indra's net, right? With each thing, each node in that net reflecting all the other nodes. So everything's interconnected, everything's reflecting all the other things, right? I love that because, boy, if you're walking or driving or moving through the world and everything you encounter, this thing, whoops, it's gone away. This thing is the center of the universe. It's like, oh, this is one node in Indra's net. And so is this, and so is this, and each thing we encounter. What a great practice. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. Other things people would like to say this morning? Comments, questions, reflections on self? Okay. Let's wrap up for today. We'll do our closing chant and then Hoshin can do some announcements. Thanks for a wonderful discussion this week. And let's go ahead and wrap up.